Of late I've been sinking some hours into Atomfall, and it must be said, I'm really enjoying it. It's not really a game that's been on my radar since announcement as such, and the market for post-apocalyptic dystopian game settings is far from underserved, but my interest certainly peaks at a game that's set in England somewhere that isn't London. Better yet, I can't say I wasn't fascinated by a game set in the northwest of England in particular, an area I'm quite familiar with, having spent a huge chunk of my formative years up north, and I still reside in what's generally referred to as that to this day. Despite my Devonshire pedigree, and by pedigree I mean inbreeding, this parcel of the plucky Isle of Great Britain means something to me. So to see that translated to a game, even a game about a nuclear disaster, and the subsequent creation of a region of horrors, I just couldn't resist. And where better to showcase the best Northern England has to offer than the Lake District, Cumbria, formerly Cumberland. However, I think we should just call it Cumland, because that's exactly what you'll feel like doing when confronted with the wealth of its beauty. And this picturesque landscape just happens to be the backdrop of the worst nuclear accident in the United Kingdom's history, the Windscale Fire of October 1957. Atomfall imagines an alternate run of events where things got a bit more out of hand than they did in reality, in which the region surrounding the plant has become a hellish quarantine zone. A land dominated by lawlessness, where a military posting's desperation to maintain order in these trying times has had just enough time to mature into a status quo of tyranny. And we, the player, assume the control of a nameless, faceless amnesiac with no memories of how we got here. We're simply thrust into a conversation with a nameless, faceless scientist wearing a gas mask, clutching his stomach, seemingly wounded by nothing in particular, simply giving us a bit of information, teaching us how to make a bandage, and then sending us on our way. This game thrusts us headfirst into this world at its earliest convenience. We get a taste for this region's newfound lawlessness as we're forced to fistfight a man wearing a police hat who's absolutely no match for these forgetful hands. And then we make our way outside, observing the desolation and beauty in equal measure, as we're still a far cry from thoroughly getting our bearings. The opening is incredibly plot-light and it can be off-putting, but it is done with purpose, and that purpose is the mystery, made apparent as we approach a lonely telephone box with a ringing phone. On the other end of the line, a voice providing us with cryptic direction.
Oberon must die.
We're unleashed upon this world with the sense of having a mission. However, it's unclear what that mission is. We are simply dropped in the deep end, so to speak, and we have to figure it out for ourselves. We have to explore, investigate, find leads, find clues, find information wherever we can find it, just to understand what's actually going on here, much less what we need to do. We don't at first realistically know where to go, nor who to trust. We have to live vicariously through an amnesiac who's just come to in the middle of a show. So off the bat, if anything, it's quite immersive. Suddenly, we have a narrative reason for taking our time and soaking in this world. Because all of it begins as a mystery, and we only jump in with very limited explanations, and googling the Windscale disaster can only get you so far, whenever you're stopping to observe something, you have no idea if it's going to be important. Whenever you're stopping to speak to an NPC, you have no idea if they're going to be useful, and you have no idea if they'll even turn out to be on your side. They may give you information, clues or leads, they may even ask you to do stuff for them. But all of this works to cohesively help you put together this mystery, and every interaction and objective feels like it has multiple opportunities that take you in different directions. Atomfall's introduction introduces you to the concept of an open-ended staging point for soaking in this world and all the information it possesses. Furthermore, it doesn't guide you to observing it from a particular angle. You have to come to those conclusions yourself. There are a multitude of pathways through this game, and at no point does it necessarily feel linear. The trade-off being you have to go out of your way to look for the story, with the bulk of it being told through notes that you'd find that may or may not provide leads to spur you onwards, and the odd bit of dialogue with whomever here and there. And this works well with the game's strong emphasis on environmental storytelling, something I'm a sucker for, so in that respect it's no shocker Atomfall managed to retain my interest. Now that's the premise of Atomfall anyway, an environmental, investigatory story that avoids more traditional linearity like the plague, instead relying on delivery means that encourages you to go out and explore this world space. I didn't observe it to be especially groundbreaking as such, but it is appreciable and enjoyable if your mind is open to that experience. Another thing I appreciate about Atomfall's storyline, before we move on to talk about other things, is the fact that it isn't terribly long. Now, modern games seem to have come down with a case of delusion that bigger automatically means better in every conceivable way, and while at times it can help, and astounding massive games certainly exist, often it's used to disguise mediocrity with bloat. When a game is shorter, it doesn't have that leeway, and while a short game can still ultimately end up mediocre, when it isn't trying to be a 100-hour-long experience, there's a sense of honesty to it, especially on a modern market, that at the very least off the bat makes me more receptive to what the game is doing, even when the novelties are somewhat superficial. That's because longer games often have novelties that are exclusively superficial as well, so you have much more time to get used to and frustrated by a game's shortcomings, or indeed lack of innovation. Atomfall's very investigative nature means there's replay value, but ultimately, any one playthrough can be reasonably short. It's nowhere near over before you realise it started short, it just doesn't feel like a colossal waste of the player's time based on the quality of the game in front of me. It has noticeable shortcomings in various areas, and if you go in expecting a Fallout adjacent game, I have a theory you'll be disappointed. I've seen this game compared to the Fallout series countless times, and while I understand that, I don't think it's as good a comparison as people make out. Fallout is a 1950s retro-futuristic post-apocalyptic role-playing game, where the general premise is the world has crumbled in a nuclear war, and those that have survived the world over to our knowledge are out for survival. From that very quick summary, you can see where the comparison creeps in. The Windscale fire took place in the 1950s, and Atomfall presents an alternate timeline where that had some serious long-term ramifications that converted the immediate area at least into a post-apocalyptic-esque environment. There are elements of retrofuturism, but the intent of the game beyond this is entirely different. The Fallout games are flagship AAA RPGs from a big studio. This is an action survival game made by a small team, where the burden of unravelling the story rests with the player, rather than simply on a quest marker. The setting is arguably Fallout-like, albeit being set in the UK rather than the US, but beyond that finish it's not a Fallout-like game. If you get along with Fallout's general world building, then Atomfall doesn't fare too badly on that front, but it's not that expansive and prioritises different fundamental elements. So while the comparison isn't fundamentally flawed to the point where it has no value whatsoever, if you go into this experience expecting it to hit all the same beats as the Fallout games do, you're setting yourself up for disappointment because you've now got a standard the game has, frankly, no interest in hitting. But now, let's move on and talk about Atomfall's biggest selling point, Cumbria. Well, Cumberland. It's not quite the same thing, but in the UK, counties have largely lost their meaning altogether. If you've ever been up to the Lake District and surrounding areas before, then you're more than likely familiar with this region's visual prowess, delightfully blended with a distinctly blue-collar Northern English culture. So how does Atomfall translate that to a game about a nuclear disaster desolating it? The scenery catches that rural English aesthetic quite nicely. Roads marked with dry stone walls accented by road signs. Those lovely, charming black and white Lake District signposts all over the show. Rural cottages galore. A luscious green landscape that perhaps goes a bit overboard on the foliage. Sweeping views of hills and lakes. Rusted out Morris miners quite literally everywhere. And at the heart of it all, a picturesque, hilly, mossy village that feels oddly familiar despite not being real. And Atomfall doesn't make the mistake of overcorrecting in desolating that necessarily. Yes, there are obvious signs that this is not an ordinary time, whether that be through the big robots with threatening voices, or the nuclear power station in the distance across the lake spewing something into the atmosphere that doesn't seem conducive to good health. This is not a Fallout-like world that's been transformed into a hellish-looking underworld, a mere barren wasteland forged in atomic fire. This is an isolated, quarantined region in a world that is otherwise fine, where the isolation and martial law has caused societal decay. So outside the central village of Wyndham, you can expect to find a copium of outlaw activity. I'm not sure what's inspired them all to garb up in such out-there outfits, but I suppose the local state of affairs has forced them into a life of crime merely to survive. At least until I come along and fix that, I suppose. Then you have druids, pagans to a mysterious religion of some description that I suppose are intended to showcase the culture that has emerged from this struggling region in wake of such an impactful disaster. They clamour on about mysterious plot-relevant voices, and they have a penchant for melee weapons and archery. And that's all well and good, but I have to say, if I was out in the Lake District and I came across some druids, I can't say I'd necessarily be surprised. Nevertheless, they're an aggressive bunch, and a great source of arrows if ranged combat is your thing. Beyond that, of course, you have the military presence that dominates Wyndham Village and Scathemore. They're a bit tyrannical and perhaps even complacent. Some time has evidently passed since the disaster that put them in this mess, and from that passage of time, a class divide has emerged between them and the civilians they're here to protect, I guess. Now, they appear to rule through intimidation. They're known as the Protocol, and they have big aggressive robots, and that tells you all you need to know. There are no clear-cut allies among the factions present, and that makes engaging with these factions a bit more interesting. Then you have ferals, people who have been zombified by some mysterious means, transforming them into unrecognisable monstrosities, akin to the residents of Barrow in Furnace. But they're reasonably uncommon to happen upon randomly. Above ground, despite the quarantine, most things are reasonably tame, and most threats are reasonably Earth-like. So aside from some ferals, some funky glowing purple beehives of some description, and the occasional dead glowing animal, unless sheep just do this, the otherworldly horrors are largely contained to the game's underground regions. This area is known as the Interchange, and as its name suggests, it can be accessed at various points above ground. Think of it as an interconnected tunnel network that connects various overground locations, and it appears to be infested with some variety of parasitic business that if you spend too much time surrounded by, you can be affected by it. The most common symptom of this, aside from eventual death of course, is the fact that you'll hear voices. And that's as interesting as it is unsettling. Whatever is going on here is a bit more expansive than merely a nuclear disaster. And whatever that is having a profound effect on any exposed to it for too long. The druid sort appear the least affected, but definitely have some connection considering their affinity for, well, voices. Wildlife such as rats and birds appear to have glowing blue eyes and present aggression, suggesting they too are affected. Ferals therefore must be affected to a higher degree, but deep in the pits of the Interchange you'll happen upon an enemy archetype even more disquieting. Thralls, people in gas masks who simply walk towards you with glowing bluey-green eyes. They'll eat up round after round after round, seemingly unaffected until they eventually die, and all they'll do if they close the distance between themselves and you is shove you until you die. I wouldn't call them necessarily frightening, but where there's one there's definitely more, so they certainly pose a huge challenge, but it's that lifeless aesthetic of the gas mask being utilised in an artistically inspired way, creating an enemy that doesn't appear to feel pain, possesses no thoughts, no personality. They are just walking lifelessness. It creates such a fascinating atmosphere while navigating the Interchange's dark, most infested corridors, because when you find yourself faced with one of these sausages, you know you're in trouble. Not only that, you're incentivized by the mystery. The more you see the impact of whatever's going on down here, the more you're spurred onwards to find out exactly what that is, and Atomfall's world spaces are full to the brim with information to soak in on that front. Altogether, if you like investigating this caliber of mysteries, the world that's been created here is rich with that immersive element, and it uses the backdrop of the 1957 Windscale fire as a jumping off point of sorts for its world building. It doesn't stick to the history, as you can tell it deviates quite substantially, but what it does is uses that for inspiration and then colours the world around it to formulate something that feels quite effortlessly fascinating. And that odd familiarity of the overground world enriches that. Even if I've never specifically lived in Cumbria necessarily, that northern atmosphere certainly carries over. So I do have a bit of a positive bias for this world. And perhaps it is that more than anything that's compelled me to engage with it. That vague recognisability of a game that's set a short ways up the road, seeing it in a state of perpetual emergency and trying to figure out where the differences come in, and I'm sure that's more compelling for people who live in the immediate area. And I've definitely got a soft spot for observing NPCs talking about obscure British towns. An Oud Village bloke talking about how he'd give anything to be back in Swindon of all places, or a lady daydreaming about an exotic holiday to Brill. And it sure does sound funny because neither of those places are particularly exotic, but it reminds you the world outside this quarantine zone is still ticking onwards, even if you can't tell if that's better or worse in Rill's case, and this calamity is not occurring in a vacuum. I will say the accents used in this world are a bit all over the place. I noticed plenty of Welsh, Scottish people, Northern Irish and all manner of English accents, and they range from decent to questionable, which I know is probably an amusing thing to hear coming from my hybrid lips. And beyond that, the wealth of slang is fascinating, but I feel they missed a trick by not including more obscure regional slang that more comprehensively transforms an entire sentence, because nothing amuses me more than watching people wade through heavy colloquialisms, just entire phrases that don't sound like English at all and the subtitles just read unintelligible would have done the trick. Sure, 90% of the time, if not 99% of the time, it's better to be able to understand the dialogue that's being presented to you. But I reckon Atomfall, playing it safe in this respect, while it's nothing to mark the game down for, is robbing the player of an opportunity to get an ear for it. Because in my vast experience of slang in this hellish land, once your ear's in, there's not much that isn't straightforward. But if you're an American watching this video, then stick around on this channel and you'll hear me say some avant-garde things eventually.
Who's there? Come out slowly. Who are you?
Oh yeah, this game is set in the early 1960s, of course there'd be a Russian spy. Now, before this video thoroughly outstays its welcome, let's talk some gameplay. Like I said earlier, the general gist of it is a survival action experience. Now, you can treat it as a shooter, but ammunition at the very least is supposed to be rare, and yet it isn't necessarily if you know where to look. You can only carry limited amounts of each ammunition type, so you've got to place your bullets quite carefully. For me, my weapon of choice turned out to be the bow and arrow, because all you need to do to resupply on arrows is pick them up off the bodies you drop or go and pop a few druids. If you keep your distance, the archery is incredibly easy to use, and it's also quite satisfying, especially considering the general stiff gameplay Atomfall boasts. The downside, of course, being, ammunition is at least meant to be rare in this game, and your inventory is geared towards that idea, so you'll be using whichever weapon you happen to have ammunition for if you wish to go the ranged route. Also, while the bow is complementary to the stiff-feeling ranged gameplay, I want to say the guns don't necessarily fare so well. There are a variety of weapons at your disposal, and some are more satisfying to use than others. Your rifles are your jack-of-all-trades weapons that don't really have a specialty, they're just effective. However, depending on the rifle, they can be a bit of a pig to use. As expected, at close quarters you can't go terribly far wrong with a shotgun. They do, as they tend to in games, colossal amounts of damage at short range. For these naturally faster paced situations, they're also fairly quick on the reload. Then of course, pistols are incredibly useful if you need to unload an ungodly amount of bullets into something in rapid succession. As for SMGs, I don't really know because I didn't use them very much, as it's too intoxicating to run out of ammunition incredibly quickly. Furthermore, for close quarters encounter you have melee weapons such as knives, axes, sickles and all sorts, and yes, you can lob them and things if you've had enough. But I didn't particularly enjoy that as much as keeping things at an arm's length and blowing them to pieces with a shotgun, or indeed the more stealthy possibilities presented by the bow. Stealth gameplay I wouldn't say is particularly impressive and typically results in finding a place to hide and firing arrows at a group of outlaws or something, and using the confusion of their allies dropping dead to draw them all to one place and then pick them off one by one. But you'd be right in saying that's not a fluid stealth system. If you're trying to be stealthy on the move, you'll probably find it doesn't work so well. So I find stealth to be best applied as manoeuvring yourself to where you want to initiate open conflict. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, and there are moments where it does work a tad better, but it feels better suited to a combat control method rather than avoiding combat altogether, though I'm sure, if you're far more patient than I am, you can certainly use it. But things like stealth takedowns can be quite loud, especially earlier in the game when you haven't picked up the perk that makes them quieter, so stealth at times can be a bit limiting. Now I'm going to loop this bit in here because I feel like it does fit into what I'm talking about. One of my favourite things about Atomfall is the fact that you can kill absolutely everyone, and by everyone, I mean everyone. The game doesn't soft lock you out of progression because you decided to kill every plot relevant character you happened upon. I wouldn't seriously play the game like this necessarily, but I did find it quite amusing. I mean seriously, what other game gives you the voices and lets you go on a generational, indiscriminate neck-snapping spree? I sure do love a mildly schizophrenic game, and in that respect at times Atomfall feels tailor-made for the unhinged. I mean, think about it, we're trusting nobody because the voice in the telephone box says it's a bad idea. There are druids in the woods, there's an alien rock underground that's inspired the residents of Barrow to have a day out, and we can't go 5 minutes without booting the f*** out of rats. Of course you can kill everyone, the voices demand it.
Watch your step.
In fact, when you're facing any character from behind, the game practically compels you to give it a go. I've got to say I love when a game allows you to be as chaotic as possible for the hell of it. Now where was I? Oh, the gameplay. Away from that, Atomfall is a survival game. You pick up bits and bats, you craft, you heal, you eat, you drink tea to no discernible effect because Britain. This is the strangest game of pool I have ever played. Oh, and your inventory is incredibly limited in space, so you're constantly managing it. I've seen people say it's a touch too limiting, but I don't know, I've had no issues there. I also found the skill system to be reasonably concise and not terribly overwhelming, and you unlock skill points by finding training stimulants in the world. The more training stimulants you have, the more skill points you have, and the more skills you can invest in. Standard skill system. The game also puts emphasis on preparation, so any reloading, crafting and stuff you want to do, you need to do before you enter combat, because the menus in which you craft, in which you manage your inventory and all that, they don't actually pause the game. Crafting and reloading can take time, you'll just about get away with going to the menu to heal, so your best bet for combat encounters is to go prepared wherever you can be, and I like that you're not some power fantasy tank in this game. You're just an average whoever. We don't know. We don't see the character's face. We could be playing as a lizard for all I know, but it's gameplay in which it's easy to kill and easy to die. So hurling yourself into a combat scenario against multiple enemies without method and preparation is sure to not end well. Despite this, I wouldn't necessarily call the gameplay difficult. It's well balanced, and that makes adjusting to it quite straightforward. Once you get in the routine of crafting bandages, bombs, finding first aid kits, keeping an eye out for ammunition, get the hang of the bow and arrow in particular, and unlock a few perks, apocalyptic Cumberland is your oyster. You could definitely make an argument for wanting to see the gameplay smooth out in certain respects, but ultimately what I like about Atomfall is it could easily be a proof of concept. Now I have no idea if Rebellion intend to give this game a sequel down the line, but if that is in fact the plan, Atomfall sets the foundations quite nicely. It doesn't overload you with stuff to the point where you run out of patience with the game long before you run out of things to do, and it's respectful of your time, instead favouring a more concise experience that highlight the calibre of game it's trying to be. It does have some rough spots, there's no day-night cycle, there's no real weather changes, so the world doesn't necessarily feel as dynamic as it could have been, just to name one example, but it is a game with charm and heart. And if this is all it ends up being, a one-off game, I have to say I've really enjoyed it. So to conclude, in my opinion, Atomfall, overall, is alright. I'd like to thank you all for sticking out my nonsensical ramblings. I sure do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. It would of course be massively appreciated, but if you don't want to do that, then don't worry about it, it's chill. I'll disappear. But with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point, but until next time, please take care, and goodbye.